This is Paul Schwartz with the Montgomery County Sentinel, and we are honored to have our guest, Senator Chris Van Hollen, who has been on TV quite a bit lately. The key was the statement you made when you asked Barr that question a couple of weeks ago. But before we go into I have questions. I really want to talk about impeachment of the president, but after what happened yesterday, I want to jump right into Barr. He said, and I want to get your reaction to this, he said that the president had the authority to shut down the investigation if the president felt that was unfounded. To me, that sounds like means that the only way the president would allow the investigation to continue is if he felt it was founded, if there was a basis to it. And so what is your reaction to what happened yesterday at the Barr hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee?
Well, first, let me say it's great to be with you. And I think what we saw yesterday at the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing was an attorney general who was bobbing and weaving and ducking lots of questions. And where he did try to explain his position, it didn't make sense and was certainly way out of the mainstream of legal thought. This effort to defend the notion that the president could fire Mueller because he thought that Mueller, maybe in some way conflicted, would just obviously be a cover story for firing Mueller because Mueller was getting to the truth. And that would clearly be part of an obstruction of justice charge. In fact, the president must have known it was inappropriate because he also instructed Don McGahn, his lawyer, to lie about the very fact that President Trump had asked McGahn to fire Mueller. So, if that was all okay, why would he ask Don McGahn to lie about it?
Right.
Clearly, this was a president engaged in an attempt to block and obstruct an ongoing investigation into his own wrongdoing.
Now, you have gone on record as asking him to resign, but you specifically asked the Attorney General Barr whether, and I quote, "Would Bob Mueller support your conclusion," meaning the 4-page summary of the findings, key findings. That it clearly was a lie, because he said he did not, his answer was that I don't know if Bob Mueller would support my conclusion, and that came after he had already received a letter, which clearly indicated, the letter of March 27th, which clearly indicated that Bob Mueller did not support his conclusion. So lying to Congress, most of the indictments from the Mueller investigation were about lying to the FBI. Now, this guy is on record as the Attorney General, the chief law enforcement person of the country, is on record as lying to Congress. He tried to get out of it yesterday by saying that Charlie Crist was talking about the people on the team. You clearly were not talking about the people on the team because you said specifically Bob Mueller. So my question to you is there a basis to go beyond asking for his resignation and to actually impeach him, or maybe even worse, indicting him for lying to Congress?
So first, you're right. I believe he deliberately misled me, the Congress, and the American people when he answered that question, because I asked him if Bob Mueller had supported his conclusions, the conclusions that the Attorney General put out in that 4-page memo. He said he didn't know, but now we know he was in possession of a letter from Mueller where Mueller clearly expressed concerns about the conclusions that were put in that 4-page memo. So where do we go from here? The right thing would be for him to resign. He can no longer be effective as Attorney General. He's engaged in a pattern of misleading comments and statements to the American people, which is why he can no longer serve as an independent Attorney General. Never has been one. He's been a spokesperson for the president. The question has come about whether or not the House should begin to impeach the Attorney General. And I'm going to have to leave that to the House. The House has so many issues on its plate with respect to these investigations right now. They're doing their best to try to hold this administration accountable. This is an administration that has engaged in all sorts of, in my view, lawless conduct, and an administration that is trying to stonewall Congress at every turn. So the question, for the House is what makes most sense given the whole array of challenges they're facing. But let me say this: I think that Attorney General Barr lacks now the credibility. And that is a penalty he will have to pay because he's no longer believable or trustworthy. And it's a shame.
Yes.
It's a shame that we have an Attorney General who has not met the standards of the integrity of that office.
On that note, someone who we both know quite well, Brian Frosch, when he ran for Attorney General for the state of Maryland, he made it clear that he was the people's attorney, not the governor's attorney. Barr has made it clear that he is Trump's attorney, not the people's attorney. I asked this question to Jamie Raskin a few weeks ago, and he said this would take a constitutional amendment. What that is whether the Attorney General position, because it is different than the other cabinet positions, should it be an elected office rather than appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate? Would that make a difference? And if so, is it worth going through a constitutional amendment to get that done? I just want to get your sense.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure that would, in and of itself, solve the underlying problem here, right? It's possible that if someone runs for the office of Attorney General of the United States, that they could also have a very political agenda. And so that's why we've actually tried to shield the Attorney General from politics to the extent possible. I mean, obviously the Attorney General is appointed by the President, but goes through the Senate confirmation process. But this Attorney General got through that Senate confirmation process, I will say, after the rules had been changed. It used to be that you needed to get a supermajority. You needed to get at least 60 votes to clear the procedural hurdle for an Attorney General that was controversial. Those rules were changed. So we now have an Attorney General who is acting politically, and as you indicated, as I indicated, as the chief propagandist for the President of the United States. A totally inappropriate use of that office. How we protect ourselves against that, in my view, at this point, has to be the political process. It needs to be the public weighing in. The House should consider, how to remove the Attorney General. But the ultimate decision as to, how they're going to prioritize everything in front of them is for the House.
Right. How ironic that Roy Cohn's name is probably more popular now than it was ever before in history.
Yeah, for him to be the role model of the President tells us a lot, right?
On that note, though, I wanted to jump to the note about the changing the rules in the Senate. Clearly, this is not the Everett Dirksen Senate. This is the Mitch McConnell Senate, and he has changed the rules. With Merrick Garland and the rest. If in 2020, let's say the Democrats do not just keep the House, but take over the Senate, and hopefully the White House as well, in order to undo the damage that was done by this administration and this Senate, do you anticipate that we, the Democrats, would go back to regular order or seize the precedent that McConnell has established just to undo the damage with things like gun safety, the stuff that was passed in Congress, H.R. 1, H.R. 8 on gun safety, on campaign finance reform, which I know you're very big on, voter suppression. What would be the right course of action to take? Either apply the McConnell rules or go back to the way it should be and set an example?
Well, it's a very good question, because what you see is over time an erosion of the rules that attempted to make the Senate a more bipartisan place, right? The whole idea of requiring a supermajority vote in order to get to the final vote. The final votes, as you know, are always a strict majority vote. But in the Senate, the reason for the 60-vote procedural protection is to encourage and motivate more bipartisanship. But unfortunately, those rules have been eroded. And once Mitch McConnell sort of remove some of the additional barriers with respect to nominations, it's hard to argue that we should go back when we have a Democratic president and put a Democratic president at a disadvantage. So I think it's very unlikely that we would go back with respect to those rules changes. As to rules changes going forward to the fundamental issue of the 60 vote on cloture on some of these other issues, look, people can debate that. I think you always have to ask yourself the question, though, what happens when you're in the minority in both the House, the Senate, and the White House, because there's a lot of damage that can be done in the opposite direction. I mean, I'll give you one example on the issue of a woman's right to choose. That issue is still subject to a filibuster in the Senate. And had we not had that 60 vote protection in the last Congress, it's very possible that you could have seen a federal law passed by the Republican-controlled House, the Republican-controlled Senate, and signed by President Trump. So it's just important that people understand all of what's at stake in considering something like that.
All right, now jumping back to the original reason why I wanted to meet with you is the impeachment question. And in my mind, the circumstances are far different today than they were in 1998. That seems to be a concern as to not moving forward. 1998, Clinton was a popular president. Trump in 2019 is not. His favorability rating is like 37%, unfavorability 59%, or something like that. Also, the impeachment of Clinton was about a personal transgression that he lied about. And with Trump, in the Mueller report, it said that the transgression for Trump was obstructing an investigation into a foreign adversary. So the circumstances being different, my question is there still a value, even though we know that the Senate is not going to remove him, regardless of what the House does with impeachment, is there a benefit to having impeachment hearings now so that the public is educated on the full nature of the issues against Trump, even if it doesn't result in removal?
So, Paul, what I think is important to have happen right now in the House is a series of very important hearings. I don't know if you have to start by calling them impeachment hearings, but I think that you need to bring before the House the key witnesses, starting with Bob Mueller, but also the key characters that appear in the Mueller report, including Don McGahn on the issues of obstruction of justice, and the other witnesses regarding Russian influence. I think anybody who actually reads the 400-page report, and it is a big document, I don't expect most people to have the time to read it, but I think people would be pretty horrified about the fact that the Trump administration, the Trump campaign, welcomed this help from the Russians. The decision by Bob Mueller not to find the president and his campaign liable for criminal conspiracy with the Russians, it's a very high bar, right? I mean, it's like that, to meet that bar, the President of the United States and his campaign, they got to get together with the Russian government, and they got to be working together to conclude. So they didn't. That threshold was not met. But I think people would be really horrified by the fact that all the evidence in the report showing the Trump campaign was happy to take this Russian support. So bottom line here is what I'm saying is I think it's important to bring those witnesses before the Congress because the public hasn't really heard that story in that kind of format. Right. And what Barr was all about in terms of his 4-page memo was trying to frame the national debate and conversation, right? He wanted to put the Trump spin on it. So that's what a lot of people have heard. That's why it's important to bring these witnesses before the Congress. And then the House can decide where to go next and what the public sentiment is with respect to moving forward with any kind of impeachment.
Speaking of the Mueller report, we talked a lot about Volume 2 on obstruction, which to me is a lot more comparable to what happened in 1974 than in 1998 with Nixon the obstruction was caught on tape. With Trump, the obstruction was in plain sight in many cases. And Mueller made it clear in the report that that does not preclude an obstruction offense just because it's done out in the open, you know. So hopefully, but I understand what you're saying, to basically lay the foundation for it so that people understand. So if we do go to impeachment, there's more support for it.
Yeah, I think you need to, really let the public know the full story, and hearings are an appropriate way to do that. I should say that, with respect to Russian interference in our elections, this is one area where, at least on Capitol Hill, a lot of Republicans and Republican senators agree with Democratic senators that we need to do something to prevent that kind of interference going forward, which is why Senator Rubio and I have introduced a bipartisan bill. It's called the Deter Act. That would make it clear up front to the Russians and to Vladimir Putin, if we catch you interfering in our elections again, there will be immediate and severe economic penalties placed on your economy. Not a few sanctions against some of your oligarch friends, but really hard-hitting penalties. So if you're Vladimir Putin and you're in the Kremlin and you're thinking, what are the benefits of me interfering in the 2020 elections in the United States? You will have to think long and hard. Right now, he can do it without penalty, right? And he can do it, in fact, in a way that he has some, he's stirring up trouble and turmoil and conflict in the United States. But if he knows beforehand that he's going to really get socked, my view is that can deter interference.
That will lead me to the last question, because I know we're running out of time. On that note, you worked on this bipartisan bill. I know Amy Klobuchar has also worked on a bipartisan bill, the Secure Elections Act, and there's also the Honest Ads Act that she worked on with McCain, obviously before he passed. My question to you is, what is it going to take to get the Republican side to actually support these bills? Because apparently these bills from Klobuchar were killed by Trump. He told the Senate not to go forward with it. How do we do that? Because the key is not just volume 2 with the obstruction, but volume 1 with the interference of the election, which to me is probably even a greater risk. So what do we have to do to move forward in order to address that issue and basically to get this legislation passed? What is the breaking point for Republicans?
Well, that's a very good question, and that is actually the question of the day as we go forward here. Are Republicans going to do the right thing to protect our democracy? Because we have a clear and present danger, and the heads of Trump's own intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies are telling us that it's not just a past threat, but it's a future threat. In fact, Chris Wray, the FBI director, within the last few weeks, talked about his expectation the Russians would interfere again in 2020 if we don't do anything about it. So we need a multi-layered defense. The first is deter, right? So if you can deter the Russians or any other country from interfering in your elections in the first place, that's obviously the first line of defense. But the Secure Elections Act, Senator Klobuchar's bill, which I support, I'm a co-sponsor of, and other bills, those are also important to sort of harden and protect our election-nearing systems. You may know in Maryland, it turned out that a Russian company owned one of the companies that was supporting the Maryland elections. There's a company called ByteGrid in Maryland that provided a lot of the infrastructure support for Maryland's elections. Yeah. That in turn was owned by a company controlled by a Russian oligarch close to Putin. Now, the FBI discovered this more than a year ago. And the good news is it was monitored carefully and there was no meddling in the 2018 elections in Maryland. But I raise it because I've introduced a bill along with Senator Collins, Senator Cardin, to make it clear that no state can have any part of its elections infrastructure owned or controlled by any foreign adversary. I'd like to say any foreign company at all, but certainly any foreign adversary, whether it's the Russians or, that just seems to be basic common sense. So that's another example. We would hope that the Republicans, the majority of Republicans would join us so that we can get these things passed to protect our elections.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
I look forward to to seeing you on CNN and MSNBC again as you ask the right question to the right person.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. Thanks for your questions.